A second Minneapolis resident was killed by ICE agents on January 24th, just one day after a general strike was called in the city to protest the January 7th fatal shooting of Renee Good and weeks of brutal ICE abductions targeting non-citizens and citizens alike. Just hours after ICE agents shot 37-year-old Veterans Administration ICU nurse Alex Pretti 10 times, Trump regime officials falsely labeled him a domestic terrorist intent on killing federal officers, repeating the same lies with which they attempted to criminalize and demonize Renee Good. 1 week after Trump ordered the Department of Justice to open investigations on Minnesota Governor Tim Walz and Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey, alleging they obstructed ICE operations, both men had phone conversations with the president described as positive. The White House announced on January 26 that Border Patrol Supervisor Greg Bovino was relieved of his command of immigration enforcement operations in Minnesota, and that an unspecified number of his agents would also soon leave the state. That same day, a federal court judge in Minneapolis heard arguments from Minnesota officials seeking to end what they called an unlawful and unchecked invasion by some 3,000 federal agents in violation of state sovereignty under the 10th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. A recent letter from Trump's Attorney General Pam Bondi to Governor Walz had demanded the state turn over voter registration records, welfare program data, and repeal sanctuary policies in exchange for reducing or ending federal immigration operations in the state. Your reporter spoke with Madison McVan, a reporter with the Minnesota Reformer, an independent nonprofit news outlet, who talks about her state's residents' courageous response to the escalating wave of Trump ICE state violence.
The Bureau of Criminal Apprehensions here in Minnesota investigates most law enforcement involved shootings, and so that would cover shootings by federal agents as well. So while they were able to access the scene of Renee Good's killing, the FBI and DHS took the evidence with them and have since blocked BCA from accessing evidence like the car that she was killed in. When it came to the killing of Alex Pretti, they didn't even let BCA investigators on the scene. So the BCA showed up, like they normally do, to go check out the scene and gather evidence, and, the federal agents blocked them. So then they went to a court and got a warrant to access a public street, which is a really unusual move. Came back with the warrant, and the federal officials still did not let them access the scene. So the state's being totally shut out of this. It seems like even some Republicans in Congress are showing some kind of interest in investigating the killing of Alex Pretti, but I'll kind of believe it when I see it. It seems like the DHS is more interested in investigating itself.
Madison, I did want to ask you about this violence here we've seen. With 2 people killed in the streets by ICE agents over the last several weeks, has the threat of violence from ICE been at all a damper on the protest movement? Have people expressed fear that being out in the streets with their whistles and protest signs against ICE agents that are conducting their operations is inherently dangerous? And again, has this really had an impact on the ability of protesters to get out in the street and make their voices heard?
I would say that it has increased people's fear, but it has not dampened protests. People are scared, but I think they're also feeling like they're backed into a corner and they're fighting back in ways that I've never seen before. It feels like in the Twin Cities, at least, which are, these are deep blue, like extremely liberal leftist places. And there was kind of the groundwork formed for community organization during 2020 and George Floyd that is kind of being brought back up to the surface now. And we're just seeing widespread organization and participation. And I think one of the things that makes people feel safe is the idea of safety in numbers. Protesters know that ICE can find out who they are. They know the government can track their license plate or look up their name or use AI to scan their faces and find their identities. They all know this. So they're under no misconception that they can keep their anonymity. They just think if we all keep showing up, then we're all going to be safe. So we're seeing that play out in lots of ways in the Twin Cities right now.
There are many people who are observers of what's going on in Minnesota with this ramping up of the ICE raids and the thousands of agents that have been deployed there. And they see this as a test case that if Trump can employ violent repression in Minnesota without accountability, then we could soon see what's happening in Minnesota be exported by Trump to all 50 states. As someone on the ground there in Minnesota, do you think that's a valid point of view in terms of we may be at a pivot point in our country, in our democracy, with these tactics, these violent tactics that are being deliberately targeted on Minnesota?
I would say it certainly feels like a pivot point. I mean, it feels like we've reached a new level of violence and state repression here in Minnesota. But I wouldn't declare this a Trump victory and say that this tactic will work elsewhere, because I'm not sure it's worked in Minnesota. I mean, like I just said, this has inspired so much collaboration and pushback amongst the general public that I just don't know if they'd have the manpower to do this across the country. Even here, it doesn't feel like they have the manpower. They're certainly getting their arrests. You know, they're still arresting immigrants, and, you know, 2 people have died so far. And actually, I don't think I've heard you mention yet, a 3rd man was shot last week. He wasn't killed. But, you know, I don't know if it's necessarily a win yet.
Madison, I did want to ask you about the Minnesota National Guard that Governor Walz had activated. There's been some commentary about fear of confrontation between federal immigration agents and the state National Guard if they are deployed in the same place for different purposes. What, if anything, can you tell us about that?
Well, so far, the deployment of the National Guard seems to not have been an escalation like many thought it might be. I mean, they basically showed up. The reason that the National Guard was requested by Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey was that he was basically just saying, look, our police resources are stretched thin because of everything that's been happening. We just need more support on the ground. So the National Guard really just came out to the neighborhood where Alex Pretti was killed on Saturday. They instituted a curfew, and the National Guard was basically just in charge of making sure everything stayed quiet in the neighborhood in the days following Alex Pretti's killing by an immigration officer. But, you know, we also saw National Guard go out to the Whipple building, which is the headquarters of ICE in Minnesota. And there's been kind of a standing protest there for a couple of months now. But the National Guard went out and started handing out coffee and hot chocolate and donuts to protesters. So I think that, you know, they're kind of walking this line of trying to be a de-escalating force rather than trying to escalate with either ICE or the protesters.
That was Madison McVan, a reporter with the Minnesota Reformer, an independent nonprofit news outlet. Find more news and analysis about escalating ICE violence in Minnesota and nationwide by visiting our Between the Lines website at btlonline.org.